all in this together, and we're fighting for all of our lives in this movement. So we want to thank you for that. So you're giving me a lot of hope. Okay, so the ACLU does have a special role in supporting young people and all people in their movement work, and it's really to support you. We want to support you with information and with resources, and make sure that you know that you have the right to express your beliefs. We're not an anti-gun organization. We're a nonpartisan organization that stands up for civil rights and civil liberties in the Constitution. We are pro-free speech and pro-everyone has the rights, no matter what, who they are. And so that means that we work on a lot of issues of fairness, justice, and equality. You'll see the ACLU fighting for voting rights, for women's rights, immigrant rights, LGBTQI rights, for protesters of all kinds, standing up for Black Lives Matter, and students taking a knee, and for our government, and even that we want our president and our government to be held accountable to our democratic system and to our Constitution and our Bill of Rights, so that in this country, no matter where you are, the ACLU can help you move that forward. So, no matter how much money you have, no matter who you love, no matter what you believe, we all have rights in this country. So if you believe in those things as well, there's a few ways you can get involved with the ACLU today. Okay, so you can volunteer at ACLU events, especially in the summer. We have all kinds of festivals and things we show up at, but we have all these volunteers here who've been signing you in, volunteers who've been providing you food and snacks, so that's something you can do. I want to personally invite you to a special event happening next month in April, so that's going to be on April 17th at the Moore Theater downtown. Anthony Romero, who is the director of the National ACLU, will be speaking. We will be providing free entry to anyone 18 or younger, and there's an email you can use to RSVP, which is events@aclu-wa.org. And you got hopefully a piece of paper this evening with a bunch of information on it. Did people get a piece of paper? Somebody give me a sign. Okay. No? Yes? No? It's several different pieces of paper. Did you get some pieces of paper with information on them? Anybody? Okay, so nobody got paper. Okay. All right, so if you had gotten a paper, oh wait, okay, she's got one. All right, how come, okay, thank you. So that's what it looks like. So try to make sure you get that. Thank you. Why did you all say no? Okay. Okay, great, so you have the paper. We want you to, so there's a lot of information on there, which I'll come back to. You can join our email activist list, doesn't matter how old you are, as long as you have an email address. And that way you'll know some of the things that we are asking people to do, like contacting legislators or knowing important things that are happening in the community. For those of you who are in school, you can start ACLU clubs at your school. Who's got an ACLU club at your school? Who's here? So, okay, a couple of people do, yay. So that's something that you can do, and we can provide you support with that, and that's on that piece of paper that if you don't have, please get one. You can tell your teachers about ACLU online resources, because there's a teachers network there too, so the teachers can help you and support you in lifting up your own rights. For students, there you can become a member of the ACLU for $5, just $5 a year, so that's accessible. There's also something else that's on the paper that I just want to call out. There's a youth essay contest that happens every year, and what's amazing about that is you could possibly win a trip to Washington, D.C. to attend the ACLU's national conference in June, hear from amazing speakers, hear about different ways to be activists, and meet allies from all over the country. So that would be a fantastic opportunity. And most of all, you can know your rights. That's something why we have these events every month, and we want people to know your rights. You can help other people understand their rights once you've got a grip on it, and you can speak up whenever you see anyone else's rights being violated. You can speak up and stand up for one another and call the ACLU if you need help. So lots of resources here to let you know how you can do that. As Dr. Martin Luther King said, injustice anywhere is a threat to justice everywhere. And honestly, justice is under threat, and so we have to fight together to keep the world safe and fair and equitable for everyone. So thank you for all of what you already do. And now I want to tell you about our featured speaker, who's amazing. amazing. And her name, where is she? She's over there. Also, you don't want to come up on that side because you could possibly trip. So come up on this side. Thank you. All right, so this Vanessa Hernandez is the Youth Policy Director with the ACLU of Washington. She works to promote the civil rights of young people in the education and juvenile justice systems. She's a graduate of the University of Washington School of Law, where she was a Gates Public Service Law Scholar. And before she went to law school, she taught middle school history and drama. She is the parent of two amazing young children who are talented and so much fun and wonderfulness, Manny and Elena. And so, you want to wave, Manny and Elena? Yeah. 8 and 10, the future. And so, that's who Vanessa is. So I'm going to let her come up here and tell you what she wants to tell you. And thank you for being here.
Hi, everyone. I am so excited to do this because I will tell you that, as an ACLU lawyer, you spend a lot of time in very serious meetings and writing very serious papers. And literally my favorite part of my job is when I get to go into schools or go into youth groups and work with high school students and middle school students, because to some degree I feel like I can just talk and not have to lawyer it up. Although I will lawyer it up a little bit because I am going to be doing a Know Your Rights training, which hopefully I can actually get to. Brian will save me. Specifically focusing today on 5 major civil rights lessons, because as a former teacher, everything's got to be a lesson. And I'm going to spend a lot of time on the first part of this, which is rights around speech and protest and political participation, particularly in schools. So, 5 civil rights lessons. We're going to cover free speech in schools, specifically public schools. We're going to cover police searches. I might make some of you practice how you engage if you are encountering an officer who wants to search you or question you. We're going to practice your right to remain silent. And then at the end, we'll talk a little bit about education rights when you're facing school discipline, and also anti-discrimination issues in schools. And then if we have some extra time, I'm going to talk about smartphones, because smartphones are a gigantic civil rights issue. There's actually an ACLU technologist who did a TED Talk entitled, "Your Smartphone is a Civil Rights Issue." So we will get to that if we have time. So, the first thing I want to note, and believe it or not, this comes as a surprise to some school administrators, is that the Constitution protects everybody in this country. It protects you if you are 5 years old. It protects you if you are 55 years old. It protects you if you are a voter. It protects you if you're not a voter. It protects you if you are a citizen or not a citizen. Every single human being in this country, by virtue of being a human being in this country, is protected by the Constitution. So the fact that you are a minor under the age of 18 doesn't mean that you aren't protected by the First Amendment to the Constitution, which guarantees you the right to freedom of speech, meaning to speak your mind, and also to petition the government for redress of grievances, which basically means tell the government, who are the people who are working for you, that you think they're doing a piss poor job and should get it done correctly, right? And you have that right, even if you are in school. So this is one of my favorite cases that I got to break out a lot recently. Tinker versus Des Moines, which is a case from 1969, and it is an ACLU case involving a young woman named Mary Beth Tinker, that's her, who was 13 years old and opposed to the United States' involvement in the Vietnam War at the time. And she decided, along with several of her friends who shared that viewpoint, to wear a black armband with a peace sign tied over her, shirt and wear it to school one day. The adults got so upset about that the school board actually passed a policy that prohibited the wearing of black armbands with peace signs on them, and said that any student who did that would get suspended. Not to be bowed, 13-year-old Mary Beth Tinker went to her middle school with a black armband and got suspended. And then she hired the ACLU and they sued. And they won. And the baseline principle of Tinker is students do not shed their constitutional rights at the schoolhouse gate. So you might be required to go to school. If you go to a public school, the government is the one providing your education. But the fact that the government has a responsibility to educate you and that you have responsibilities as a student doesn't mean your constitutional rights to freedom of speech just evaporate because you happen to be in school. So that is a great baseline principle. But like with all things in the law, there are some exceptions. So here are the basic exceptions. If you are in a public school, now I will say private schools are very different. They basically can do whatever they want because they're a private institution, within some limits. But for the First Amendment, they can squash your First Amendment rights. But public schools generally cannot limit student speech unless it falls into one of these three categories. And I will talk with you all about exactly what these are. We'll use court cases as examples. So a school can limit your speech, meaning they can prevent it or they can punish you for it if it is defamatory or libelous. We'll talk about what that means. They can punish your speech if it is obscene, lewd, or profane. And again, we will talk about what that means and doesn't mean. Or if it is actually disruptive or can reasonably expected to actually disrupt class time or school operations. So we're going to go through a bunch of examples to talk about what this looks like. And I encourage you to ask me questions. So really, if you feel like I'm not explaining this well, hands up and let's go. Defamatory. Defamatory speech most often comes up in the context of student news or publications. And what defamation basically means is this. You're talking about a private person. So the president, for example, is a public figure and can't threaten you with defamation, even though he seems to think he can. So you're talking about a private citizen. You make a statement that is untrue, factually untrue, a statement of fact that's untrue, and you know it's untrue, or you should have known before you said it, and you didn't bother to find out. So the most recent case of this that came up in Seattle is actually out of my neighborhood, out of Roosevelt High School, where the Roosevelt High School newspaper published an article about a local slumlord named Hugh Sisley. And they made a bunch of statements along the lines of he was a reported slumlord who had a bad reputation and had been accused of racist renting practices. The landlord got very upset and sued the high school newspaper for defamation. And what the court said there was, look, that's not actually defamation. Because, one, all of the statements of fact that the students, a reported slumlord, for example, there were actually reports reporting that this person had been called a slumlord. And all of the other statements were statements of opinion, right? Had been accused of racist renting practices, had been reported to have a bad reputation. Opinion statements aren't subject to defamation because it's literally just what you think. And the courts in this country aren't going to be in the business of policing whether what you think is true or false. It is what you think, right? So as a general matter, unless you know something is false and it is about a private figure, the school can't prohibit it just because they disagree with the statement, and the government can't punish you because they disagree with it. Obscenity. This is a really fun one to do in schools because I get to say all the words that the schools can't, don't allow other people to say. Schools are allowed because they sort of stand in the place of parents and are there to create a reasonable educational environment to limit speech that is totally okay for adults to say out on the street or for ACLU lawyers to say KEXP in front of crowds of high school students. So, for example, you can tell the president to piss off, right? Legally, that is your right as an American. It may not be the most strategic thing to say. It may not be the most polite thing to say, but if legally you have the right to say that. You probably can't legally tell your teacher to piss off, right? Because schools have an interest in making sure that teachers can teach and maintain order. And when students engage in sort of profane speech with their teachers, that undermines their authority and undermines the ordinary operations of school. But if speech is political in nature, schools have to consider the entire context in which the speech is said. And that means that even if a school might find something a touch off color, they can't necessarily prohibit it just because they might think it's obscene. So again, the cleanest example of this is an ACLU case out of Pennsylvania called BH versus, I think it's Eatonville School District. And in this situation, a number of female students wore bracelets during a school day, acknowledging breast cancer awareness. It was actually like a day at school where everyone was talking about breast cancer awareness, and they wore bracelets that said, "I heart boobies," which was, at that time, part of a large national campaign by a national organization to raise awareness of breast cancer by having everybody walk around with "I heart boobies" bracelets, right? Because it sparked attention, it sparked conversation, it got people talking about prevention and intervention and healthcare and breast cancer risk and all that stuff. So the school did not like that middle school students were walking around with "I heart boobies" bracelets. They told the students to take them off. The students refused. They got suspended. Well, noting a pattern here. The students sued, and the courts found that in the context that the word "boobies" was used in this particular context, it wasn't obscene, right? It might be obscene to talk about an individual's boobies, but in this particular context, as part of a general national awareness raising campaign, this wasn't obscenity, it was political awareness. And the school had to take into account the entire context. They couldn't just say, "Oh, well, we wouldn't let kids talk about each other's boobies." It's like, of course not, but that's not what this bracelet is about, right? So what that case taught us is that speech has to be clearly obscene or lewd or profane in context. It's not just enough that the school might wish you used different words, right? They actually have to prove some clear obscenity. The other area where this comes up a lot is whether speech or expressive conduct is disruptive. So I'm going to talk about this in a couple of different contexts because there are lots and lots of different ways that you can speak at school, right? You can speak by wearing Mary Beth Tinker's black armband. You can speak by wearing an "I heart boobies" bracelet. You can speak by wearing a t-shirt with a political message on it, or even just coordinated t-shirts of all the same color, right? If everyone in your school shows up one day wearing orange, that means something. Or you can speak by walking out, right? Or by giving speeches in class. So I'm going to talk first about clothing. As a general matter in schools, clothing and armbands and buttons and things like that are among the most protected methods of speaking. And schools can't prohibit students from wearing clothing with particular messages or clothing that expresses a particular message unless the school has actual evidence that that shirt or clothing is disruptive or will certainly cause disruption, and there isn't another way for the school to deal with the disruption but banning the clothing. So we'll talk some really specific examples here. First, let's talk about the example in the middle, that young man wearing a shirt that says, "Jesus is not a homophobe." That, again, his school suspended him for wearing that shirt, and he sued for the right to wear it. What the courts found there was that there was no actual evidence of a disruption caused by that shirt, right? There were students who disagreed with it. There were other students who didn't like it. There were faculty members who didn't like it. But the fact that someone else didn't like it is not in and of itself disruption. And so he was granted the right, his right to wear that shirt was recognized by the courts. The other place where this comes up a lot is at prom, with people who want to wear clothing that is not consistent with gender, either the gender identity that the school assigns to them or to which they were assigned at birth, or not stereotypically associated with their gender. So there have been a number of cases of female students who wanted to wear tuxedos to prom and were actually banned from prom because they were told they couldn't wear tuxedos. That's unlawful on a couple of levels. One, it's a violation of the First Amendment, right? Because clothing sends a message. As a female student wearing a tuxedo, that sends a particular message about who you are. And the fact that other students might think it's silly or might not like it is not in and of itself a basis to outlaw it. In Washington State, we have an extra protection because we have a state law against discrimination that prohibits discrimination in schools based on gender identity, gender expression, or sexual orientation. So what that means in practice, according to guidance from our State Office of Superintendent of Public Instruction, is that dress codes have to be gender neutral in Washington State, which means if it's acceptable for any student to wear a dress to prom, it's acceptable for all students to wear dresses to prom. If it's acceptable for any student to wear a tank top, it's acceptable for all students to wear tank tops. And you cannot prohibit one student from wearing something based upon a stereotype about their gender or sexual orientation or gender expression. The one area where this gets a little bit dicey is in the context of shirts or clothing that send very particular messages that touch upon areas of historic tension in that community. So the area that this has been coming up a lot in lately is Confederate flag shirts or belts or, flag flying off the back of your truck at school. I will tell you that the courts have split on this massively and dramatically. As a general matter, though, schools have only been allowed to prohibit the wearing of Confederate flag t-shirts if they can produce concrete evidence of a few things. That there is a history of racial tension and racial segregation and racial oppression in that particular community, that the wearing of those shirts is targeting to one group of students or another, and that the school has tried other means to intervene and it hasn't worked, right? Without those factors, courts have usually said that schools cannot prohibit the wearing of those messages, even if they are incredibly hurtful and contrary to the school's values. But in some instances, courts have allowed schools to prohibit that. So that is a very fact-specific situation. The one thing I will always say about racist or hateful or homophobic or sexist or any other speech that is contrary to the values of non-discrimination is that even if a school cannot legally, under the First Amendment, prohibit a student from engaging in that speech, they can absolutely legally, and they have an obligation legally, to intervene in the broader school climate and to make clear where the school stands in terms of non-discrimination, to provide educational opportunities for students about the history of these issues, and to make sure that students who are or feel targeted have safe and appropriate ways to get support and intervention, okay? Because it is one thing to wear a passive statement of your own belief, and it is quite another thing to deliberately target another student, right? So that's a line that I think schools have to be very, very conscious of, and one, frankly, that students have to be very conscious of. Because a lot of times you'll hear, well, I can't prevent it because they have a First Amendment right. And while that may be true, that doesn't mean schools then just throw up their hands and do nothing to prevent discrimination and do nothing to ensure that they have a school climate that is safe. Make sense?
May I ask you a question?
Yes.
I work at Seattle Central College, and this issue has come up. One professor was talking about how a student in her class was wearing a shirt with a Confederate flag on it. And I get what you're saying. So the question I have is, what's considered disruptive? Because, without a brawl breaking out in class, nowadays a lot of people talk about triggers. Is that considered disruptive to an individual? And I also want to add that faculty are very divided on and many of them are confused or feel incapable of, how do you deal with this in a classroom and have an open, fair discussion without, it may not be in this community that people have that, racist experience, but we have people at the college who come from the Deep South, and, so it's very convoluted.
So I think there's a few questions there. The question about what is a disruption, I'm going to get to that in the next couple of slides. So I'm going to ask you to hold that. Like, what's the threshold by which something becomes disruptive or not? The second question about resources for educators. So the ACLU has a webpage right now that's Take a Knee. So if you search aclu-wa.org/take-a-knee, that's specifically dedicated to my next example, which is going to be about students kneeling for the national anthem or the Pledge of Allegiance, specifically to call attention to police brutality and the deaths of people of color at the hands of the state, right? But one of the things we do link to there is a number of curriculum resources that are specifically designed to facilitate effective conversations about race and racial history in the United States. The other resource that I'll point folks to is that the ACLU's one of our senior staff members, Jeff Robinson, did a presentation locally, which you can also find on the history of the Confederacy, and specifically why that symbol carries so much weight. Brian, do you remember what the title of that is? It's something like The Truth About the Confederacy or something like that. If you search ACLU Jeff Robinson Confederacy, you'll probably find those videos on YouTube.
Go to our events page.
When Heritage Meets Hate. Thank you, Michelle.
It's on our events page.
And it's on our events page as well. So those would be two particular resources to facilitating those conversations that I would direct folks to. Okay, so let's talk about what constitutes disruption, okay? This is the Garfield High School football team. Yay, Garfield! I don't know if they are still doing this, but all of last year, the entire team knelt in solidarity during the playing of the national anthem at every single football game. Now, how many of you think that that is disruptive? Oh, good, you're all excellent ACLU members. This is absolutely not disruptive, right? Although I will tell you that in some parts of even this state, people tried to argue that it was, right? A silent statement of passive resistance is absolutely not disruptive. So sitting or kneeling during the national anthem, refusing to say the Pledge of Allegiance, those are not disruptive, right? The fact that other people might not like it is not in and of itself disruptive. And the Supreme Court has held since 1944 that this country, under the laws of this country, nobody can be forced to pledge your allegiance to the government, right? That is sort of contrary to the entire founding of the American state, which was all about revolution against the government. Silent protests like this, kneeling, refusing to stand, refusing to conform to a particular creed or ideology, that is almost never considered disruptive. One thing, though, where schools might be on slightly stronger ground to talk about disruption is student walkouts. Now, I know a lot of you walked out on March 14th, and I'd be interested, just by a show of hands, if any of you faced any school consequences for that, whether, like a stern talking to or a call home or anything more than that. Okay, that's really interesting. Because I will say that how schools approached the walkouts was just radically different, not just between school districts, but even within school districts, right? There were some schools in this district that treated this situation differently than other schools. So as a general matter, right, when schools are considering whether something is disruptive, the disruption has to be substantial and material to the ordinary operations of the school, right? Substantial material to the ordinary operations of the school. So, for example, if you have a teacher who is trying to teach class, and suddenly everybody in the class stands up and starts shouting the teacher down and refusing to let them teach for the entirety of the class period, that is a material and substantial disruption of that class, right? The lesson that the teacher had planned isn't able to get accomplished. It's the entirety of the lesson, and the sole purpose of that teacher in that room at that moment is to teach the lesson, right? So student walkouts are generally considered by the courts to be disruptive. Now, whether it's actual or whether it's substantial and material, I think in part depends on how long it is, how long the class period is, whether you come back, right? But as a general matter, walking out of school isn't a consequence free, or doesn't, the First Amendment does not require that schools make walkouts consequence-free. The First Amendment allows for the imposition of some consequences. But I think the really important thing to remember is two things, right? The first thing is, why is a walkout disruptive? It's because it's basically an unexcused absence, right? It is because you are missing the lesson that you are supposed to be getting from your teacher at that moment. Which means that your absence should be, for a walkout, should be treated just like any other absence, right? If you decided you were just gonna go hang out in the bathroom for the rest of the class period because you just didn't wanna be there, right? And if the consequence for hanging out in the bathroom for the rest of the class was that you get a lunch detention for a day, then you should get a lunch detention for a day if you are out of class because you are engaged in a political walkout. If the ordinary consequence for an unexcused absence, if you just walk across the street to go get a soda at the gas station and don't come back, is a call to your parents, then the consequence for a political protest walkout should be a call to your parents, right? The punishment that you receive for a walkout should be the same as the punishment you receive for any other unexcused absence. And if you get harsher punishment, that would raise questions. Yes? Okay, so if you get a harsher punishment for walking out of school for a political protest than you would have otherwise received, that would raise questions about whether the school was engaged in discrimination against you because of the viewpoint or the message or the content of your speech. The other thing, though, that I will say about walkouts is in Washington State, no student should ever be suspended for a political walkout. Under Washington State law governing suspensions and expulsions, schools can't typically suspend a student unless you've done this kind of thing before and the school has tried another intervention and it didn't work, right? So for you to get a detention or for you to get a suspension for a political walkout, you would have had to have a history of unexcused absence. The school would have had to have tried other kinds of interventions like calling your parents or doing a conference or having a detention, and only then could they escalate up to suspension. And then the last thing I'll say about walkouts and political protests is that if you engage in political protest outside of school hours and on your own time, it is none of the school's business. And you should never face any consequences at school because of that. That doesn't always mean that they don't try. So the last, the most sort of outrageous story that I've heard from the student walkouts this past week is not actually in Washington, thank God, but in Nevada, where a student walked out of class on March 14th at 10 o'clock for 17 minutes and used that 17-minute time to call his congressman, which is an excellent exercise in democracy, more power to him. And he told his congressman, actually his congressman's office staff, that his congressman should get off his effing a-hole and do something about gun control. Which, you have a constitutional right to call your, right? I would not advise yelling at legislators. Our students just called us and said these words and that's not okay. And the school suspended him for 2 days? For 2 days. For using profane language towards a congressman. There is no, off-campus speech, right? The speech that you engage in your own time, off campus, is generally none of the school's business, even if they don't like it, right? The one exception to that is if your speech has a direct disruptive effect on the school's operations itself. So, for example, if you are relentlessly bullying another student off campus, you can be disciplined for that bullying even though it occurs off campus because of its direct connection to the school. Now, one time calling a congressman, telling a congressman that he needed to profane word, right? That is not an actual disruption to the school. So the ACLU is now representing that individual, and I imagine that situation will be resolved very quickly. So any questions about First Amendment rights before we talk a little bit about the sort of what comes next, right? What comes after you've expressed your viewpoint? Yes.
What if you're like, what if, I heard the story of somebody who was protesting across the street and he had a sign that was political and I believe had profane language in it, and he got, I think, at least suspended from the school because of protesting across the street with a political sign that had profane language. Would that count as disruptive if he was like across the street?
Was it during school hours?
Yes.
So if you are protesting during school hours and what you are doing is visible in school, I think there's a lot of questions I would ask about whether that had an actual impact on the school itself. But if you left school grounds, again, the content of your speech is, there would have to be some clear tie that the school would establish back to an impact on the school. And I'm not automatically seeing one in what you're telling me. The facts really matter in First Amendment cases, right? What counts as a disruption is a really fact-specific question. And so one of the most important things to do if you're facing any discipline because of this is to get really, really clear about the facts. Where were you? When was it? Who was around? And actually ask the school if they're suspending on the basis of disruption, what was the disruption? Because a lot of times the sort of instinct is, well, I didn't like it, and so it was disruptive, but that's generally not enough, right? There has to be some actual impact upon the school in order for it to be considered disruptive. Any other First Amendment type questions? Yes?
Can you address bullying by social media?
Yes.
To what extent?
So typically the courts have held that that students can be disciplined for bullying behaviors that happen over social media that sort of meet the school's definition of bullying and that have a significant effect on the school environment, right? And bullying is one of those things that does have a really significant effect on the school environment, particularly if it is bullying on the basis of a protected characteristic, right? Like race or gender. So as a general matter, and we'll get to this when we talk about smartphones, off-campus speech is more protected than on-campus speech, right? You have more rights in off-campus speech, but just know that if what you are saying has a direct link back to the school, they're much more likely to be able to impose discipline or punishment because of it. Any other First Amendment-y questions? Yes?
So my school would have students sign a contract that would kind of impose extra limits on like what you can wear, this and that. Are you actually have to sign those?
Is it a public school or a private school?
Public.
So a public school is asking you to sign a contract imposing extra limits on what you're wearing, like you can't wear.
As well as like behavioral stuff and this and that.
Yeah.
As far as like what you're wearing.
So as a general matter, it depends on what happens if you violate the contract. Right? I would say that if a school is asking you to, sign a contract saying, like, I promise to be, in my lovely children's case, a safe, kind, responsible member of my school community, right? Because that's their little creed. That probably doesn't rise to the level of any questions. If a school is generally requiring you to sign a contract that says, I will never say anything bad about any of my teachers, that would raise many more questions, particularly if the consequence for that is to do something like deprive you of your right to education. So that would be one of those where I'd say, that's curious. I'd want to know more about that. Any other questions? Yes? That's a great question. How would you define disruptive for a 7th grader? Meaning, if you want 7th graders to know where the line is that they shouldn't cross, what I would say is something that prevents you from learning or prevents teachers or other school administrators from doing their jobs to help you learn. That's a great question. The one thing I'll say about 7th graders, I could not tell you how many people are like, but they're middle schoolers, so they don't have First Amendment rights. To which I said, See Mary Beth Tinker, who was a middle schooler. There are lots and lots of cases here where 9, 10, 11, 12-year-olds are exercising their rights to freedom of speech. And while age is a factor, right, schools have a greater interest in protecting elementary school students from colorful language. That doesn't mean that First Amendment rights go away. So that's a great question. Anything else? Yes?
So out of curiosity, the question that came before that, given the fact that most students are considered minors, if they were to sign a contract like that, how binding is that?
A minor signing a contract in and of itself is not binding legally. That was a great question too. All right, any other questions about the First Amendment stuff before we talk about what comes next? Okay, so one of the things that makes me most excited about the moment we are in, and I'm not just talking about the youth responses to Parkland, although those have been amazing, but the way that youth have been engaging in the Black Lives Matter movement, and frankly the way that youth have been showing up for decades in social activism, is that this isn't just about wearing a t-shirt to school and then saying like, oh cool, I've done all my social justice work for the day, I'm good, right? All of these movements are dedicated not just to making your voice heard, but making sure that your voice is heard and used in ways that actually change laws and policies, right? And so what I want to flag for folks are a couple of ideas for ways to get involved in next steps. And I say this regardless of what issue you are working on or what position you take on that issue. So Legislative Advocacy 101, okay? In Washington State, we have a state legislature that has two chambers, the House of Representatives and the State Senate. The Washington legislature is a part-time legislature, which means they don't work all year round as legislators. All of our legislators have some degree of other jobs, right, that they do when they are not in session. Washington's legislature is not in session right now. Session just ended. The next legislative session begins in early January 2019. That doesn't mean that they're all doing nothing legislative-y right now. What happens between now and January is what's called the interim period. That's when lawmakers sit down and they meet with their constituents and they meet with stakeholders and they talk to each other and they do research and they figure out what bills are we going to be introducing in January, what's going to be moving, what policies are we worried about. So if you want to influence the legislative process, if you want to make sure that a particular type of law gets passed or doesn't get passed, this is the time to get on into it, all right? So the very first thing you should do, and this is true whether you are a voter or a non-voter, whether you are a minor or an adult, is find your legislator. That's the web address. And you go in there, you type your address, and it pops up the people who represent you in the House and in the Senate. Now, what's particularly interesting about this year in Washington is that the entire House of Representatives is up for election in November. And half of the Washington State Senate is up for election in November. So if ever there were a time that your legislators were particularly primed to listen to their constituents, might be that kind of time. So find out who they are and call their offices. You can schedule in-person meetings. Many lawmakers are now back what's called in district, meaning they are where they live. They are living and working in the place with the people they represent. Go find them. And set up meetings with them in district. You can also meet with them in Olympia when they are in session. You make phone calls to their office. I don't advise yelling at legislative staffers because they are the nice people who make sure that your messages get passed along to lawmakers and who schedule those meetings. So always be nice to them because they're not the decision makers, but they are very important in terms of you having access. You can send letters, you can write emails, you can sign petitions, and all of this work happens now. It doesn't all start in January. This is when it starts. The other thing I will flag is if you want to know what's on the table for a particular issue, Washington State has actually a pretty wonderful bill tracker where literally there's a drop-down menu of every topic they are considering legislating on. You can scroll through it. You could, for example, find, freedom of speech, and it will pull up a list of every single bill the legislature has considered for like the past 20 years on freedom of speech. Just go look at a couple of the most recent ones. See, what are they proposing? Who's working on this? Is this person your representative? And how can you have influence on what happens? The other place I would say is incredibly important is school boards. I don't know if any of you have ever been to a school board meeting. They are their own special little thing. But I will tell you, your school board meets at least once a month, and your school board sets all of the policy for your schools. So a lot of schools right now are having conversations about school safety. What makes you feel safe? Is it having more police officers in school? Is it having your teachers carry guns? Is it having more mental health counselors, right? Is it having social emotional learning curriculum? Whatever it is, if you're not involved in those conversations, if you're not going to school board meetings, those decisions are getting made without you there, right? So I can quickly show each and every one of you how to figure out where your school board's agendas are, when they are meeting, who your school board members are, and how you can get involved in it. I will guarantee you that students showing up to school board meetings has more of an impact than almost anything else, okay? So that's another big thing. Now, I don't want to spend too much time on the rest of this because I also don't want to keep you all night, but I want to really quickly touch on the other big lesson. Okay, so you have the right to refuse police searches. Now, in schools, how many of you go to school that has a police officer sort of on campus every day? Yeah, and I would say that many schools in Washington do. So the general rule is this. Your teachers are not allowed to search you or your stuff unless they have reasonable suspicion that you have violated school rules. And we could get into exactly what that means, but I'm not going to focus on that tremendously. Police officers, even if they're the nice officer who's on your campus every day, sometimes they call themselves school resource officers, sometimes they call them campus resource officers, whatever they call themselves, they can't search you unless they have a warrant signed by a judge, or some kind of a recognized exception, like there's an emergency and they believe there's, you have a deadly weapon and they need to get it out of there right away. I will tell you though, that most searches in schools don't happen because of either of these things. Most searches in schools happen because the super nice officer asks if they can search your backpack and you say yes. Okay? Literally, if a police officer or a teacher has a constitutional ability to search you, right? If they have reasonable suspicion or a warrant, they're going to search you whether you say yes or not. And they have that right. If an officer or a teacher comes up to you and says, hey, mind if I take a look in your backpack? That tells you they want you to approve it. And once you've approved a search, it doesn't matter if they had a legal reason to search you or not, because you've approved it. And you've basically given away your constitutional right to be free from unreasonable government searches and seizures. So if an officer asks you to search, the first question you should ask them is, are you asking me or ordering me? And then if they are asking you, you do not have to consent. And you can say no, and they should move on. Yes? In terms of your right to be, no. The age of the student does not factor in terms of your right to be free from unlawful searches and seizures. You have a constitutional right to be free from unlawful searches and seizures even if you are 11, right? The government, which includes your teachers and police officers, can't search you unless they've got reasonable suspicion for teachers or a warrant for officers. So the automatic response when an officer asks you to search, are you asking me or ordering me? And I do not consent. We have little wallet cards that lay all this out. Yes?
I'm wondering if this applies to lockers as well.
Oh, that's a great question. The question was, does this apply to lockers as well? Under Washington state law, lockers are considered the property of the school, which means that the person who consents to the search of the locker is your principal, not you. So don't put anything in your locker that you wouldn't want your principal to find. Yes? The same thing for desks. You have a right to privacy in your person and in your personal effects, like your backpacks and your wallets and your purses. You don't have a right to privacy in the things the school owns, like the desks or the lockers. Yes? If an officer says that they are ordering you to, then you can just say, I do not consent to this search, but and then, let the officer do their job. Because if they are ordering you to search you, that means they think they either have a warrant or a reasonable exception. You can ask an officer if they have a warrant, and if they do have a warrant, they should show you a copy of it. But if they don't have a warrant, that means they think they're operating under a reasonable exception, and that they're going to do it whether you consent to it or not. All right. So the other right you have when interacting with police is the right to remain silent when questioned. This is actually an area where age really does matter. So the Fifth Amendment protects your right against, gives you a right against self-incrimination. Have you, any of y'all ever heard, I plead the Fifth? What they are actually saying is, I plead my Fifth Amendment right to avoid self-incrimination. Translation, government can't make you snitch on yourself. That's really what the Fifth Amendment says. And you also have the right, if you are a suspect in a criminal investigation, if you are accused of a crime, you have a right to a lawyer. And if you can't afford a lawyer, the government has to give you a lawyer. Those two rights combine to mean that if the government is questioning you, if a police officer is questioning you because you are a suspect in a criminal investigation, you have the right to remain silent. But that right doesn't apply if you waive it, right? If you talk to the officer, if you agree to engage in conversation. So, the first question you should ask if a police officer comes up and wants to talk to you is, am I free to leave? You're gonna get one of two answers. Yes? In which case, congratulations, you are not a suspect in a criminal investigation, and you can decide whether you wanna leave or chat with the nice officer. If you ask, am I free to leave, and the officer says no, automatically in your head, big blaring red alarm bells, it's the Titanic, right? The ship is sinking, you are in trouble. Because if an officer tells you you are not free to leave, that means that you are a suspect in a criminal investigation, you may be under arrest shortly, and you should not say a word. So, am I free to leave? And then if the answer is no, I want to remain silent, and I want to speak to a lawyer. Not your mom, unless your mom's also a lawyer, in which case you should totally make that clear. And at that point, the officer should stop questioning you. And they should call a lawyer and give you the opportunity to speak with your lawyer before you get yourself in trouble by talking to the officer when you don't know what's going on. Okay? The one other thing I will say is, after you have said those magic words, I do not want to talk to you, I want to remain silent, I want to speak to a lawyer, zip your lips. Even if the officer is super nice and wants to talk about the Seahawks, don't talk about the Seahawks, don't talk about anything. Okay? When you invoke your right to remain silent, invoke your right to remain silent. And also, you don't legally have to say the words, I want to remain silent, but it is a good idea to do it. There was a case recently in Louisiana, which I can't even, where a student was under arrest at school, and he turned to the officer and said, I want to talk to a lawyer dog. And the court held that he wanted to talk to a lawyer dog, like a canine lawyer, which, oh God, insane, right? So I understand I want to talk to a lawyer dog to mean I want to talk to a lawyer, not a canine lawyer, but just in case, okay? Just in case you happen to be in a jurisdiction where they think there are canine lawyers, say, I want to speak to a lawyer, period, end of conversation. All right, any questions about the right to remain silent? Yes?
So is there a context in which the answer to am I free to leave would be no, where you're not being considered under criminal investigation? I'm imagining just being pulled over.
Well, so if you're being pulled over, you're the subject of an investigation, which at that point may or may not be criminal. So again, if you're being pulled over, an officer is going to pull you over, they're going to ask you for your license or registration. They may decide to engage you in conversation, but you don't have to.
But I shouldn't say am I free to leave.
Yeah, not if you're being pulled over. You're right. The response is not. This applies in school or in sort of face-to-face interactions. But if you were driving, you shouldn't say am I free to leave, because you're obviously not, because you were just pulled over. Thank you for that excellent question. Yes.
This has to do with the privacy one. Does that include personal electronics? Can you be demanded to unlock
That is such a good question. I was going to cover that in bonus. Smartphones are a civil rights issue, but I'm going to answer it now because you got there first. Okay, the question was, can you be demanded to unlock your smartphone for a teacher? So personal electronics are different than like a book or your wallet, right? Because they have so much information, right? If you have my phone, you literally know almost everything about me. And so the courts have held that searches of electronic devices are different than searches of other devices, and they're subjected to a higher standard. So I would say generally, no. Your teacher cannot demand that you unlock your cell phone. If the school is investigating a particular violation of a rule, like a bullying incident, and there may be evidence of that in a particular portion of your phone, they can ask you to turn that over, but they can't just force you to unlock your phone, take your phone and start, oh, look at that. Oh, let's sign you into Facebook and chat with your friends, right? Any search by a government official, even if they have a good reason to do the search, has to be reasonable in scope, which means that the depth of the investigation, the depth of the invasion of your privacy has to be reasonably tied to the thing they're looking for. The last time this went up to the Supreme Court was like a case where a kid got strip searched because they thought she had aspirin, and the court held that was unreasonable. Yes, they had a right to search her for aspirin, but absolutely no, do you have a right to strip search a child, right? And I think that translates well to phones, because going all the way into your phone, just free unlock, is really intrusive. And so as a general matter, teachers don't have the right to do all of that. Even officers don't have the right to just peruse everything on your phone. If they're gonna look in your phone, they have to have a targeted thing that they are looking for within your phone. Yes? Do these rules apply at private school? Generally, no. Because the Fourth Amendment right to be free of unreasonable searches and seizures applies only when the government is doing the search. It doesn't apply when it's a private actor. There are some rights you have in Washington, like the right to be free from discrimination, that apply in private schools, but Fourth and Fifth Amendment stuff doesn't, unless it's the government doing it. Okay, so quickly, you have the right to education even if you are suspended or expelled. This is something that's unique to Washington, and it's new, so I always like to highlight it. You can be suspended or expelled from school for, violations of school rules. But if you are suspended or expelled from your particular school building, that doesn't mean the school gets to be like, all right, peace out, we'll see you in 30 days. Right? The school has an obligation to continue to provide you with educational services, meaning they have to give you an opportunity to keep up with your coursework, to stay current with your learning, and to facilitate coming right back to school successfully once your suspension or expulsion is over. And that is a right that you are guaranteed. It is also a right that not lots of schools are really good about making sure students know about right now. So if you are ever suspended or expelled, one of the very first questions that are out of, and it doesn't matter how long, if you're out for a day, if you're out for 20 days, right? The right applies whenever you are suspended or expelled. You have a right to education services that are comparable, equitable, and adequate to what you would have gotten had you been in school ordinarily. And then the last is that you have a right to be free from discrimination. Washington schools are prohibited from discriminating on the basis of a whole bunch of categories. That applies both in the way that teachers interact with you, it applies to curriculum, it applies to bullying and harassment situations, and our state law is among the most protective here. So if you feel like you are being discriminated against school, there are a lot of resources. We have a number of them on our website and in our guide, Student Rights in Washington State, that you can take a look at. I think we already talked mostly about smartphones in terms of searching. So I'll answer questions about that if folks have anything specific, but otherwise that's basically what I wanted to cover with you all. Any last questions?
I have a question about something you said
Yeah.
just almost just then. Is the Fifth Amendment just about self-incrimination?
There's more in the Fifth Amendment than self-incrimination, but I couldn't recite it off the top of my head right now.
Okay, the reason I'm asking is I heard you say in a private school, the Fourth and Fifth do not apply, meaning you can be forced to incriminate yourself in a private school?
So the Fourth and Fifth Amendment prevent government actors from doing particular things. But if a private school principal, for example, right, decides they want to question you about an infraction related to a school rule, the Fourth and Fifth Amendment don't limit them in the way that it limits a government actor. If that makes sense.
Yeah.
Okay. Any other questions? Yeah.
I've been involved in political actions where police have lied to me saying that I've been expelled from the school
Yes.
for participating or not answering their questions. And from my knowledge, I know that's usually a lie. But is that the case for most public schools?
So if you are engaged in a political action off campus outside of school hours, you cannot be suspended or expelled from school because you decide not to cooperate with officers in their full, analysis of that political activity. And what you said is that officers lied to you. And I will say that police officers don't have a legal requirement to tell you the truth, right? It is allowed for officers to say things that are not true in the course of their duties, right? So if an officer is threatening you that, your school will suspend or expel you, if you're engaged in off-campus activity, unless the school has a clear link that what you are doing is somehow disrupting the school's ability to educate you, that just wouldn't be correct. And you are under no obligation to answer that question. If an officer is, going to question you, then you ask for a lawyer. Other questions? Yes.
And what about gray areas like charter schools or after-school activities?
Okay, that's an excellent question. So what about gray areas like charter schools or after-school activities? So charter schools in Washington are subjected to the same laws as public schools in Washington. So a charter school, because it's run by a board of directors, isn't immune from Washington law and discrimination, isn't immune from the Washington Constitution or the federal Constitution. They are required to follow all those laws. After-school activities, it depends on who runs the after-school activity and how much it's affiliated with the school. If it is a school-based activity that is run by a teacher, they're subjected to the same rules. If it's a private operator, right, that is just using school facilities, then they wouldn't be subjected to all of the same rules. But many schools, when they have private operators come in to run after-school activities for their students, require those people to agree to comply with the laws of the state of Washington. So, for example, after-school activities that are using school property generally have to agree not to discriminate. Other questions? Yes. I'm sorry, I can't hear. The question was, does a cell phone search require a warrant? And the answer is, it depends on the degree of the search, right? So if your teacher, for example, if you're not allowed to have cell phones in class, which when I was a teacher, there were no cell phones allowed in the school building. So I confiscated cell phones, right? I would take the cell phone and say, you are not allowed to have this in school, and I would stick it in my little locked desk drawer, and I would say, have your mom call me so that they can get it back, right? That's not a search of the cell phone, it's a seizure for violation of school rules and would be legal. But if I then decided to say, now you have to unlock the cell phone and I want to read everything in your Snapchat account, I guess, well, can you read, never mind, not Snapchat, Facebook? I don't know all the social medias, people. So that would be a violation of the Fourth Amendment. Now, teachers don't need to have warrants to search, right? What they need is reasonable suspicion of violation of school rules, and the search has to be reasonable in scope, right? So it would be a fact-dependent situation on what are you looking for and why. But generally, I don't think teachers should be in students' cell phones without really extraordinary circumstances. For police, generally, if they are searching through cell phones, they will either need a warrant or a recognized exception, which the courts are still fleshing out how those exceptions apply in cell phone contexts. Other questions? Yes.
I was talking to a friend, and she said at her daughter's junior high, they have such a short passing period that kids don't have time to go to the bathroom, and that there are incentives that teachers give that if you don't use your bathroom passes during class, then you get extra credit on your grade and things like that. So they have a 0
Okay, that sounds like terrible policy and an invitation to medical problems. So, you know, what I'll focus in on is the zero tolerance policy to kids in the hall. I'm not sure what exactly that means, but under Washington law, kids cannot be suspended or expelled for what's called discretionary discipline. You can't be long-term suspended or expelled for discretionary discipline, which is violations of school rules that aren't a specific list of crimes, that are more serious behaviors like gang activity or drug activity or, you know, repeated instances of physical violence. And so if a school is saying, you know, if you're in the hallway without permission, we are automatically going to suspend you, that would raise some serious questions for me about whether they are actually complying with Washington law on suspension or expulsion. I'm not aware of any court finding that you have a civil right to use the bathroom like an ordinary human being. Courts have held that people sort of have, you know, rights to exist in public space. I'm not sure how that would translate in this context. That sounds to me like one of those sort of terrible policy situations where a bunch of parents should escalate that up to the superintendent or the school board, and I can't imagine that holding, right? And there's plenty of research about the damage that holding your bladder for an entire school day does to you. So, okay, we'll get time for one or two more questions. Okay. Well, if you all have no other questions, it has been an absolute joy and privilege to talk to you all. I would love to connect with those of you who are in school and engaged in activism to learn more about the work that you are doing and the ways that the ACLU can support your work. And thank you all for coming.